especially something that's so obviously morally muddled, like the Spanish conquest of Mexico, which of course is a problem in itself, but it's not like what the Aztecs were doing was great. And it's not even like the Aztecs were some long-standing culture like the Mayans or the Olmecs. They were a aberration in Central America. If the Spanish hadn't come in, they'd be gone very soon, because I always compare them to the Assyrians. They're not a good representation, but I digress on the Aztecs as I always bring them up. But it's just the idea that it's inherently wrong for the Western invaders, for the Spanish invaders, to invade in, but the Aztecs are not given the dignity of being up to moral debate about their own actions, even though they had, I mean, what the Aztecs did, and obviously we're doing this for the benefit of the other people. So they have ritual sacrifice of people surrounding them. So they would capture a place just like the Romans would, and those allies of theirs that instead of fighting in the Aztecs' armies, they would be selected for periodic ritual combat where they would be forced to field an army against the Aztecs. And, it's all just very awful stuff, no matter which way you look at it. And the Incas and the Mayans, by any standard, are better. But that's where it comes into this non-universalist approach when only applied to the Europeans. And I can only read that in the way that they view Western culture as above other cultures. And that manifests itself, even though they would deny it, in them believing that Western culture is the only one that is up for moral debate, while all other cultures need to be viewed in the culturally relativist lens that they would have viewed all cultures in the past. And unfortunately, it takes a lot of academic rigor and legitimacy out of the field and leads to this stuff that you're discussing, this ontological study of the meta anthropology, even though we're living in a situation where we could really use some real old school cultural anthropology, some real old school participant study in places, because like 40% of world languages are endangered, and many of them will likely just be gone. And even if they're preserved, it's going to be preserved for just the internet. But yeah, I agree with you. I agree with pretty much everything that you said.
My own approach to this is to develop something like a methodological amoralism to history and prehistory. And I think that that is the only intellectually honest way that you can go about studying people on their own terms, is to take a very, in a way, quite a cold and maybe even a cruel, amoral reasoning to everything, and to try and study it as best you can without letting moral judgments cloud your study of them, however you might personally feel about them. How the Aztec torture of their children to the god Tlaloc is a horrible, horrible affair, but I have to study it with a very dispassionate frame of reference, to just not get involved with it emotionally and not try and use it as a parable in any way, and just to study it as is. And I think when you do that, and there's a lot more richness to the world comes tumbling out once you apply that framework, there's a lot more the world becomes a much more interesting and bright and vivid place, because you can start to approach areas of human nature and the human story that are generally ignored, or have been refuted, and just see them on their own terms. And there's a certain glory in that, even though they are often horrible, or just boring. Lots of human history is quite dull. And you can, and I think that is the only intellectually honest way that you can really make a study these days, is to try and reject the moral thinking and reject anything that smacks of an ideological program, and just try and look for truth I mean, this is something I always try and impress in my own writing on people. It's just ultimately the truth wins, and truth is what matters, and truth should be the guiding star to the way that you study, and everything else should be ignored in favor of just trying to find the truth, no matter how uncomfortable that makes you or other people, because ultimately there's no other reason for academia to exist than to try and find truth.
Yeah. I mean, again, I fully agree. And this is what should be the natural manifestation of compartmentalization of academics, especially in social science and social studies. It, you need to take or at least you should need to take this amoral approach if you want to be truly culturally relative. But what I see a lot is that you have all this moral grandstanding, virtue signaling, almost written kowtowing by people when they're writing papers. And I think it would be much better off, and I'm guilty of doing a little bit of this as well. I often just say one thing, get it out of the way at the beginning, but that's the point. You can't muddle, or at least it's not as efficient to muddle your independent academic study of a subject in emotions, because once you bring emotions into it at all, and you bring more morality into it at all, then you're then opening up everything that you're talking about to the lens of morality. And once you do that, you're slowing yourself down, in the sense that every single thing you look at, you then have to look at it through that lens as well, and you're making yourself less efficient, because there's things that you're just going to slow down on a specific topic or a specific part of that topic. And I think that that's very bad. And I think we really should be pulling the emotion out of it. But what I see now is just any paper that seeks to address any of this stuff has to spend 30% of the time just being like, well, I know it's an economic study of slavery, for example. I was reading a recent economic study of slavery, and they're looking at it from an economic lens, but 30% of the book is just like, oh, slavery was evil, it's bad to be like, you almost just shouldn't look at it through that lens, because you're not allowed to separate it from this other part, even though separation and compartmentalization is the entire point of academia. It's its most defining characteristic.